Hey there, friends. Pastor Cliff Wall here, Cold Springs Church. Hope you're having a wonderful Wednesday. Hey, last week we talked about how the storyline of the Bible follows a family line, a particular family line. And so to understand the storyline of the Bible, we have to kind of get our minds around this particular family line, but God's purpose for calling that family line. We see in Genesis 3 through 11 humanity's descent under the power of sin and how devastating and degrading that really is. And in spite of all that humanity goes through in that and the judgment of God that brings upon humanity, that God doesn't give up, but that He preserves a family line through the family of Noah. But even after the flood and how they're preserved and begin again this new start for humanity, we see that fatal flaw remains, that human hearts are still corrupt. And so God begins to establish this special relationship, this covenant relationship with this particular man named Abram, whom he later calls Abraham, the father of a multitude of nations. And there's a lot of different things that are going on in the story of Abraham and his family, and there's a lot of pitfalls, there's a lot of twists, there's a lot of turns. But God makes a promise to Abraham that he ratifies with a covenant in Genesis 15, that he's going to bless Abraham and his descendants, and that through that they will be a blessing, and the other nations of the world will find blessing in and through them and what God is doing through that family. But the problem here is that sometimes this can give us the impression that God is choosing this particular family, and we see that the story plays out through the son of promise that was born to Abraham and his wife Sarah in their old age, miraculously named Isaac, that through Isaac and eventually through Jacob, that family line is going to go through Jacob and then his 12 sons. And those 12 sons make up what we call the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. But in the story of those brothers, we see in Genesis 37 that one of those brothers begins to have visions and revelations that he will rise to great prominence and power. And these revelations that he's receiving causes tremendous jealousy and envy among his brothers. So much so that they begin to hate him and they begin to plot against him, to conspire not only to be rid of him, but to kill him and to murder him. But because of some reluctance on the part of some of the brothers, instead of killing him, they decide to sell him into slavery as an opportunity presents itself. And so Joseph is sold by his brothers into slavery, into Egypt. And in Egypt, Joseph, God is with him, it tells us in the stories. And I encourage you to go back and look at Genesis 37 and following to the end of the book. But God is with him. But in spite of that, he ends up going from slavery to prison. And then eventually, because of the revelations and wisdom that God gives him, he rises to great prominence and power in Egypt. Because he has the wisdom and the revelation of God to be able to help them to prepare for a time of famine that is coming upon all the land. And so, because of his provision and because of his preparedness and his trust of God, Joseph is able not only to store up enough food for Egypt, but also to have enough to share with the other nations around them. So we see even in Joseph there in the story of Joseph that God in a small way or smaller way is bringing about that promise that he made to Abraham, that he would be blessed, his family would be blessed to be a blessing to the rest of the nations of the world. But in this case, the rest of the nations also includes Joseph's own brothers. And Joseph is in great power. He rises to great prominence and power as second in command over all of Egypt. And his brothers end up having to come to him for help, although they don't know that they're actually in conversation with their brother Joseph, but he knows. And the story as it goes, it shows Joseph wrestling with his feelings and his thoughts about what his brothers had done to him. And when he could have, in the story, used the great power that he had to bring them to their knees and to condemn them and to get vengeance against them. Instead, he chose to forgive them and to be reconciled with them and to bless them and to provide blessing for them in Egypt. And that sets the stage for us for the rest of the story of the Bible, and beginning with that great story of the Exodus. But in that story of Joseph and his brothers and the forgiveness and the reconciliation that we see there, and how Joseph recognizes that what his brothers meant for evil, that God meant for good, that God would through all of that somehow mysteriously bring about a greater good, that we find there a type or a pattern of a greater fulfillment of that in the story of Jesus. Jesus, who is a truly perfect and holy and a righteous person, and there are none others. Sometimes this is a misunderstanding that people have of the Bible, is that when they begin to read it, they expect to find in the stories of the people that are depicted there examples of how we should be holy and righteous ourselves. This was one of the objections I encountered with a Muslim imam here in my area, with some of his Muslim parishioners, if you will, there in Charlotte, that they said, well, the Bible must have been corrupted because even the ones who are considered to be the great heroes are obviously so flawed as to be totally corrupted. And he said if this was a book that was really about holy and righteous people, that the people would actually be holy and righteous. Well, that's an exercise in really missing the whole point. The Bible is a unique book in that the story of the chosen or the elect people is not a story about God choosing a particular family because they were especially and inherently righteous. Indeed, they weren't. And the story of Joseph and his brothers makes that point abundantly clear, is that they were all so very fatally flawed, just like the rest of humanity. And God is choosing to work with fallen people to redeem and to restore and to bring about a greater good for humanity themselves. And so in the story of Jesus, we find our first truly, inherently, and totally, truly, and purely holy and righteous person. And yet, out of jealousy and envy, his Jewish brothers conspire to murder him. And indeed, they do carry out that plot and that plan. And then Jesus, although he is dead and he has died at their hands and he is buried, he, in a greater way than Joseph, ends up rising again to great power and great prominence, even the greatest of power and the greatest of prominence in all of the world, all of the universe. He rises with all authority in heaven and earth. And he also, in an even greater way, chooses to be merciful and to offer forgiveness instead of vengeance and getting back and getting even for those who plotted and planned against him. And what they meant for evil, God used in an even greater way. God used the very plan there that he had with Jesus to bring about an even greater good, not only for the Jewish people, but through them for the rest of the nations of the world, and ultimately fulfilling that promise of Abraham. And so we see these parallels in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, right at the very foundations of the Old Covenant faith and right at the very foundation of the New Covenant faith. We find these very important stories of forgiveness and reconciliation among kin, and indeed to carry out God's plan to bring blessing to the rest of the nations of the world. And that blessing can only be had through forgiveness and reconciliation, not vengeance. But humanity, because of the power and the corruption of sin and the domination of sin over human hearts, has often found that they want to get back and get even, and it just leads to even greater and greater chaos. but it's in the story of Jesus, who was not just an ordinary human, but the Bible's revealing to us that he was God in the form of a human, fully God and fully human, who uh, who was afflicted at the hands of his very own people. Yet, in spite of that, he gave his life for them and for the sins of the whole world in an even greater way. So when we talk about, or when the New Testament talks about Jesus fulfilling the scriptures, it's not just the pinpoint predictions that we're talking about, but it's those overall patterns. Another word for pattern is type, from the Greek word tupos, meaning a pattern that we find an even greater fulfillment of that pattern in the person of Jesus. And there's a lot of those. And so we'll be able to understand the Bible better by understanding these parallels between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and how Jesus brings about a greater fulfillment of those patterns and those promises that we find in the Old Covenant. So the Bible is a strange book. It's highlighting an elect people, but it doesn't mean these people are elite in terms of righteousness. No, they're not especially righteous, but they're not really especially wicked either. Some anti Semites may try to use some of these stories to say, see, the Jewish people are inherently evil, and indeed they have done that more so than the rest of humanity. The Jewish people didn't sin against God because they were Jewish. They sinned against God because they were human like the rest of us, and all humans are fatally flawed. But God has given us the ultimate remedy, and that remedy is the gift of his very self, his very life. And he died so that we can live and share in the newness of life that he came to give. But that will only come through recognizing that we need the forgiveness of God, and that we need to share that forgiveness with others. And so we'll go a little bit deeper into this and show some of these other great patterns and promises that find their ultimate fulfillment in the New Testament. And we'll see how the New Testament and the New Covenant brings to completion those patterns and those precepts and those promises that we find in the Old Covenant. I hope you have a wonderful rest of this week, and God bless you and keep you in the abundance of his peace and his love and his forgiveness, and may you share that freely with the world. Amen.